Hello and welcome folks, Glorious Badger here. Today we're going to paint a dirty blood angel. I'm on the hunt for a suitable scheme for my Space Hulk Terminators. I've already tested out 3 other techniques. Today we're going to try a 4th. Here is the miniature we shall be testing on today. Normally I don't bother drilling barrels, however it is a convenient way to paint in sub-assemblies, like we're going to do today. So here we go. Pop that on there. I like to paint with the arms off so that I can paint the chest piece before completing assembly. So let's move on to the next step. I'm going to be using Vallejo Model Color Hull Red as a base layer. I'm going to get some airbrush thinner and mix in some flow improver. I'll put a bit of paper down. Save the desk. I'll test the consistency off camera because apparently that's how I roll. Here we go. Let's get cracking. I don't do huge amounts of airbrushing. It was something I learned about 20 years ago and never really kept up with. I'm going to slowly spray this base layer on, constantly moving the brush and the miniature. He is going to be a regular Blood Angel intercessor, and we're going to go with a black chest piece. I am going to be using AK Interactive weathering and oil washes, along with some pigments to finish the miniature off. I'm going to be speeding up the footage in this quite a bit, rather than chopping out masses, so let's speed things up. So there we have the base coat down, a nice and even coat of Hull Red. If we look at the airbrush, we can see it still has some of the first paint in the cup. We're going to be mixing the next colour, Khorne Red, directly into that cup. Here we go. Khorne Red has been added with a touch more thinner. If we put some tissue over the end of the needle, pull back on the trigger, and apply a gentle pressure, the air will be forced back up through the cup, mixing the paints. I'm just going to bubble up the cup and look at the consistency. And now for a little test spray. Yeah, there we go. Looks like we might be good to go. Let's get started. We want to keep these arms at such an angle that the Hull Red remains in the darkest shadows. Speed up. think we're okay here. We have some nice dark shadows in the nadir and rolling around to the Khorne red on top. I think, however, we can bring the red a bit further down to reduce the shadows a bit. Here we can see that the cup still has some of the old paint in, and we're going to add into that pure Mephiston red. We're going to be mixing it directly into the cup with an old paintbrush, along with a bit more thinners and some more flow improver. This brush is on its way out and has been resigned to basing and paint mixing duties. We're looking pretty good from above, but I think we need to boost the reds just a little bit more. The light will be coming from above, so we will be introducing the brighter reds directly from above. Increase the saturation, keep layering these reds up. I'm pretty happy with this. We've got some nice shadows worked in here, got some nice bright reds. As you can see from below, you can see the shadows. I'm going to be cleaning out the airbrush and rinsing the cup out right now. When I return, I'm going to mix up a thin mix of thinner and evil Sunz scarlet for spraying from directly above. Here we go. I'm spraying some thin layers from directly above the miniature. Working on the body right now before moving on to the arms. We're going to build up a few layers of this paint to increase the richness of the red. It's looking good. I'm now going to make up a thin mix of Wild Rider Red. This is getting quite orange now, so this will be the last layer before a light glaze. We will spray Wild Rider Red from directly above the miniature. Using Evil Sunz Scarlet, I'll make up a glaze, and will place directly over the previous layer, hiding the blends. I check the glaze is thin enough to apply. I will draw the brush from the darkest colours up and across to the brightest points. We will wait for each layer to dry before thinking about putting down another layer of glaze. Using glazes, we can blend and smooth out any obvious differences between various layers of paints. We can always go back and build up more layers of glaze to get the effect we desire. This should be enough for today. Through the magic of video, the knee has now been painted. I will be using Incubi Darkness and Dark Reaper to add a bit of colour to that knee. However, first, it's going to paint a bit more black onto the knee. I'm going to leave that to dry. While we're waiting for that, I will start on the gun. The entire casing needs to be painted black, including any parts that will be painted steel. Moving back to the marine, we're now going to put on the two transfers. I should say that I should have put these transfers on near the end after we gloss varnished. This is something I should have done later rather than now. However, I've had this yellow droplet sitting in water for a bit, so I'm going to slide it off the paper and into position with a brush. Using a project like Microsol and Microset would have been very helpful at the moment. Move this into position, take off any excess with the cotton bud. On with the chapter symbol. This one was a complete nuisance. Its shape made it not want to smooth out at all. I had to get it as good as I could before moving on. I'm now going to add a highlight to the knee pad using Incubi Darkness and then wait for them to dry. Now doing the final highlight with Dark Reaper on the knee pad. Now on to painting the purity seal. I usually start this off with a base coat of Xandri dust. However, the colour I used to use was snakebite leather. This pot is from 1994 and is still the first pot of Citadel paint that I own. The old pots were perfect. The paint is still in there. Using the black on the palette, I'm now going to paint the chest eagle. I had previously used some of this to paint the belt buckle, the bolt gun and the metallic bits on the backpack. The skull is going to be painted ivory later. I'm now going to go and tidy up any missing parts that I need to with the black paint. Now I'm going to paint the undersuit. Usually I do this using Vallejo German grey or dark grey, and then I would use a dark grey wash to shade it. I'll paint the skull on the chest now, and the eagle on the gun. I should have done this when I did the purity seal. Moving on to the leather work, I'll be basing using one of my favourite browns, Rhinox hide. We have the pouches, belts and holster to start off with the base coat. This will take a few thin coats, so I'll see you on the other side. I'll now add the highlights to the Aquila on the chest. We may have to do a couple of thin coats to get a smooth finish. I start off using Dawnstone, marking out the largest part of the highlight. Now we move on to the highlights, painting smaller areas within the Dawnstone layer. First I use Fenrisian Grey. Within the previous layer, I do a spot highlight using the old Space Wolves Grey. Now this is a paint from 1994 and has not been continued by Games Workshop. In Star, do a vintage paint, IV05, which should be pretty close. However, you can just add some more white to the Fenrisian Grey to get a similar effect. Here we go, just putting it on. This looks pretty good. It'll get the job done. Now we have to do some edge highlighting on the gun case, using the previous highlight colours of Fenrisian Grey and Space Wolf Grey. Here we are, finishing up the edge highlighting. We could use a further spotlight of pure white if we wanted to push the contrast a bit more. Next up is the wax seal and lenses. I'll be using a base of Caliban green to start off with. On it goes. We're now going to increase the highlight using Warpstone Glow. Now onto the penultimate highlight, Scorpion Green. For the final highlight, we're going to use bilious green. Oh yes. The superior green, king of the greens, moot green pales in comparison to the majesty and power of bilious green. We're going to finish off the ivory with some Ushabti bone. Followed by Vallejo model colour ivory to pick up the highlights. Finishing to leather and the metalwork. Starting off with the leather, I highlight using Scrag Brown. I try and sketch in a few scratches across the surface of the leather to indicate some wear and tear. I'm going to attempt to use some thin black paint to do some writing on the purity seal. It's a bit fiddly, so you might need to tidy it up with some Ushabti bone afterwards. It looks okay. I am a big fan of Vallejo metal colours, both for airbrushing and for brush painting. I'll be using steel for the gun and exhaust manifold for the backpack. I'm going to be painting the sniper scope later, but using the same colours that I used to highlight the gun casing. Painting the steel onto the bolt gun. an exhaust manifold onto the backpack. This will be good enough. Very happy with how this guy is looking. Content to stop painting right now and use him in a kill team or something like that. As you can see, we painted the sniper scope. However, I'm going to gloss varnish him now so he can move on and dirty him up. Vallejo gloss varnish was airbrushed onto the Mini. I waited for each layer to dry before applying the next coat. This was done to stop pooling. This should have been the point where I applied the transfers, rather than halfway through the painting. First of all, we shall use some ivory black oil paint, thin down with odourless thinners. I use a metal palette when dealing with thinners and oil paints rather than the plastic one. I put the oil paint into some kitchen towel or thick cardboard and wait a bit so that some of the linseed oil in the paint is wicked away. This will help to speed up the dry time of the oil paint. After making a cup of tea, I come back and transfer the paint into the palette and thin it down a lot. I touch the brush to the panel lines and thin down paint will get drawn along the detail to add definition. I don't go at it too heavy-handed at this point, I'm just wanting to define the details. I'm going to make some tea and wait for this to dry somewhat. Taking a cotton bud, I start to gently remove any excess oil paint. If the paint has been left a bit too long, you can use a cotton bud that's been dipped in a little thinners. As you can see, a lot of the paint has been removed, leaving the oil to pick out the details. You could remove a lot more with a brush dipped in thinners, however, I do not want to do that. Here we have raw umber and burnt umber, which we'll use to wash the entire body with. I'm going to make a thin wash of the burnt umber and using this brush, apply it liberally to the entire miniature. We shall try and paint on camera as well, although that is a struggle. Once it's been applied, we will go and make another cup of tea so that the wash can dry. The oil has mostly dried and we will take another cotton bud to the raised surfaces of the miniature, especially where we want to keep some colour showing through. This part of the process is really quite relaxing. There is certainly no great rush. You can enjoy your tea and slowly work away. I'm concentrating on any exposed edges and surfaces that are facing upwards. Here we can see the finished result, already looking very good. We're going to tidy it up a little more, however. I'm using a brush that's been dipped in thinner to refine any parts that need it. For example, the knee pads, around the torso, and around the eyes. This is where we are currently. I've done some panel lining. I did some shading over the panels with the burnt umber wash. The previous wash did tint the armour nicely. I will now brush on the AK Interactive Streaking Grime. It can certainly be airbrushed on, but I do not have a ventilated cabinet to do it in. Just applying this quite liberally over the entire model. Before you guessed it, gonna make another cup of tea while it dries. Back again with a fresh cup of tea and some dried grime on the miniature. Locating a fresh cotton bud, we will start working on the miniature, cleaning it up somewhat. These cotton buds do tend to leave bits of fluff everywhere due to their very nature. However, you can remove them with some tweezers. Failing that, you can use something like an eyeshadow applicator that is more compressed material and won't fall apart. I'm really liking how this effect is looking. It's almost making me want to collect a Blood Angels army. I can certainly imagine getting a kill team painted up along these lines. I will glue the arms on with super glue. Back again. The arms have been glued on. He is looking pretty smart right now. I am going to get a basic grey urban base painted up on and then varnish him. However, before that, I definitely need to go back and remove some of the grime from the eyes with a brush and possibly put a bit of paint back in there once it's dried. For this urban base, I'm using neutral grey, basalt grey and London grey. I've watered the greys down a bit, so we'll start smushing the paint on. I definitely need to invest in some larger brushes, especially for basing. This definitely took longer than it should have. I'll be putting on a second coat almost straight away as it took so long to complete the first layer. Moving up to the next grey, I shall start smushing it on randomly. As this is dried, I'm now going to do a coat of Nuln Oil quite liberally over the base before we start to dry brush the next greys on. I shall put this down to dry while I go and make a cup of tea. Here is some paper towel to dry the brush on, and taking some basalt grey onto the brush, we wipe the excess off, leaving barely any on the bristles, before brushing it against the raised texture of the base. For the next step, we will mix in some London grey to the basalt grey and repeat the process. Finally, we shall do a dry brush of pure London grey. Let's get the lip of the base done. The first of 2 coats of Chaos Black is going to go on now. We're going to wait for it to dry, and then do the second coat. It obviously needs a matte varnish, however, what do you think, folks? Would you be happy with this as it is? I'd be happy with it. Camera angle may have changed a bit as I had to take a picture. I'm going to add on a couple of hopefully subtle streaks of grime. I'll bring the streaks down off any suitable looking bits of armour and wait for them to dry. Using a brush that's been dipped in thinners, I can refine these streaks some. I probably have a bit too much thinners on the brush and some of them may wholly disappear. Now this is where I make a bit of a mistake. I should have matte varnished the entire miniature right now, before continuing. However, I didn't. I'm going to use brush on various pigments, road dirt, city grime, dark ash and light ash, etc. Hopefully, it should be like he at least belongs in the urban sprawl, kicking up dust as he moves along. As I said earlier, I should have matte varnished before I did this. After varnishing, I could have applied the pigments. And then to set them, I would have sprayed them with some rubbing alcohol from a spray bottle. At the time, I had no rubbing alcohol, so I matte varnished over the pigments. Using varnish over the pigments tends to darken them down quite a bit. When I took a picture for Instagram, I had to lightly brush over the finished miniature with a bit more pigments. Still, lesson learned for next time. So when I was applying the pigments, I worked from dark to light shades, working them on and off with a soft brush to slowly build up some different colours and textures. I'm going to go and get some tea and matte varnish this. I am back! Tea is good. It has been varnished, and as I said earlier, it has darkened the pigments a lot. I did put a touch of bilious green on the eyes again, just to bring them out. I'll bring up some images to show you. Before varnish, pigments are looking nice and grubby. And then after the varnish, pigments are a lot more subdued here. Not quite so obvious. And then for Instagram, it's somewhere between the two. I definitely need practice here, but practice makes perfect. Saying that, this is how I prefer my 40k, gritty and dirty, rather than as though everyone is still out on a parade ground. That is the painting done with. I do have one question for you. Out of the 4 blood angels I have now painted, what might be your favourite? The first one was painted with contrast paints, right here. The second one, here, which was a lot more subdued. The third, very contrasty version that I really enjoyed painting. Or today's version. I would love to hear your thoughts. I'm still looking for a scheme for my Space Hulk Terminators. Please, if you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing and sharing on social media. Commenting and liking does help humongously. Which one did you prefer? 1, 2, 3, or 4? Hopefully I will see you next time. Thank you and goodbye.